Hi, welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to speak with Ellen Brown. She's the author of Web of Debt. She's got a new piece out, Austerity Fails in Euroland. Time for some deficit easing. Welcome to the Keiser Report, Ellen Brown.
Thanks, Max.
Tell us about this deficit easing.
Well, what prompted me to write this piece was that Ireland's bonds were just downgraded by Moody's by 5 notches to the B category, and this was after they accepted the IMF EU bailout. Unlike Greece, which was supposedly a profligate spender and responsible for its own dire straits, Ireland was the poster child for austerity, for doing everything the bankers asked them to do. They slashed services, raised taxes, generally squeezed the people to bail out the banks. And it didn't work because there's a fundamental flaw in the euro system. The euro system is a fixed money system. It's a zero-sum game. There's no one that can create more money in order to allow the growth and the profits that are necessary in order to generate more taxes so that governments can bail themselves out of debt. So they're all in debt. And there's nobody that they can borrow from except each other. So they're all going down together.
So now your solution going forward would be, I guess, first of all, for Ireland and these other countries to simply default on the debt now because they're never going to pay this debt and they're never going to create enough phony Ponzi scheme money to alleviate the austerity measures. So it's just default, right?
That certainly worked for Iceland, which is now back showing positive growth. But I did suggest a couple of other solutions as well. One would be something on the order of quantitative easing, which would have to be undertaken by the European Central Bank, which is the only entity in the euro system which is allowed to actually generate more money. So the solution I was suggesting was called deficit easing. But another solution, which I like a lot, would be to mimic the Bank of North Dakota. In the U.S., of course, the U.S. states are in the same position as the Euroland countries, which is that they cannot print their own money. But what they can do is own a bank. Only one state actually does this. That's North Dakota. It's also the only state that is showing a major surplus, while virtually all the other states are in deficit, and many of them are in desperately bad straits, like California, which is my own state. So North Dakota has its own bank, and therefore they have their own credit machine. So you don't actually have to print money. You can generate credit with the bank. Virtually all of our money today is created by banks anyway. So if the state itself had a bank, or the country, in Ireland's case, had its own bank, it could be lending to itself. For one thing, Ireland could refinance its debt, which it's now paying almost 6% on. It could refinance it at 0% because it would be the bank, so it would get the profits back. So effectively, it would be paying 0%.
Right. So you're talking about a bailout with currency that's not interest-bearing currency. And this goes back historically in America. There have been instances of non-interest-bearing currency used. And as you point out in North Dakota, this is a similar plan in that the banks in North Dakota have the ability, as you say, to create their own credit machine, which is not in the service of an outside interest, but is purely there as a utility to facilitate the economy within North Dakota, correct?
And that's the secret, too. If you're generating your own credit, you don't want to be issuing money to pay off a foreign debt. That's where countries have gotten into trouble and gone into hyperinflation, like Zimbabwe or like Germany in the 1930s, or I'm sorry, the 1920s. But if you just create credit for your internal purposes, in other words, for your own infrastructure, so you create the credit to pay the workers, pay the materials, to build the thing, to generate the profits, which will then pay back the loan, that is a sustainable system. That's an internal currency that is required in order to have growth in the system.
Okay, so in the example of Ireland, and I would assume Greece, the government could simply create a new bank called the New Bank of Ireland, start floating money that's non-interest-bearing money to liquefy the economy, and at the same time, I would imagine that they would want to prosecute the bankers that in fact bankrupted their country, and they are free to do so because they're no longer being held hostage by the interest-wielding banking thieves who are basically holding the entire economy hostage.
The reason we call them too big to fail is there's no alternative. But if we set up an alternative, if we set up an alternative banking system, we could let them fail and just move over into this more efficient, sound, sustainable system.
All right, so let's just talk about what the damage that the Fed's quantitative easing program will do. They're doing it in the U.S., they're doing it in the U.K., they're doing it around the world. The ECB is rumored to be exploring its quantitative easing. So just to review what's happening here, the bank is taking an economy that is loaded with debt that can't be paid back, and they are encumbering these economies with more debt. So does that make any sense, Ellen Brown?
Well, I would say yes and no. That's what's happening in Ireland. They're being encumbered with more debt, and they have no way of getting out of it. The IMF is encumbering them with more debt. What the U.S. is doing, what the Federal Reserve is doing with quantitative easing, is putting some more currency out there. What you have to understand is that all of our money is generated as debt. And when private debt collapses, public debt must expand in order to maintain a constant money supply. And that is one of the mandates of the Federal Reserve. But we can't increase our debt anymore. Our debt has increased by 50% in the last 4 years. And the total paid in interest has stayed the same. And the reason is that interest rates were pushed to ridiculously low levels. And that's what's caused the carry trade and many bad things. But if you could finance your debt interest-free by going through your own central bank, which is what quantitative easing is, or what QE2 is. QE1, I agree, was a bad idea. I mean, it only served the banks. But QE2 actually helps us because it allows us to fund our deficit, which is a budget that the Congress has already set. I mean, they're going to issue those bonds, whether the Federal Reserve buys them or somebody else buys them. But if the Federal Reserve buys them, then the interest is rebated to the government, and it's effectively funding our debt interest-free. And I would say Ireland could do the same thing if they set up their own central bank. I mean, if they had a publicly owned bank that would pursue this alternative.
Let's talk about inflation for a second. Obviously, when you're creating money, there's an inflation risk. You're writing in your story in Huffington Post, to avoid inflating prices when the economy reaches full employment, the money could be taxed back to the government or returned as user fees for a public service. So talk a little. So in other words, to avoid inflation, you're saying that there is a way to manage the money supply, and the metric that you're using is full employment. So full employment is the desired goal of increasing the money supply, and that's the barometer you use whether to determine if, in fact, it's time to take some of that money out of the system again by taxing it?
Well, that wasn't quite the point of what I was saying. There are models. For instance, in Argentina, when the currency collapsed in 2001, the government for several years just printed pesos and used the money to fund infrastructure and get the economy going again. And that was not inflationary. It did not drive prices up as long as there was still some unemployment. The reason is the money goes to the workers. It goes to companies which hire more workers, which build more goods, and so you have supply and demand going up together, and so prices don't rise. When prices did start to rise was when they hit full employment. So at that point where you hit full employment, then you need to bring the money back out of the system, and you can do that with taxes, or you can do it with user fees. For example, let's say one of your projects with all this money, this quantitative easing, would be to build high-speed trains across the country. You could charge fees for those, for the trains, and then the fees would go back to the government, and that would help to pay back the loan that was used to build the trains.
Now, your model, Ellen Brown, is very centered on employment and jobs and wages, and you're looking at the central banking system in terms of a way to, let's say, provide more egalitarianism in the system, and to avoid, it would appear, the excesses of when you have just a few bankers controlling the money supply and then draining off most of it for their own ends and claiming that there's a trickle-down effect that will trickle down to the wage earner at some point. But you're taking the opposite approach. You're saying central banking works, but if you focus on the wage and the worker, you can create more of a balanced system, and you can always tweak the flow of cash, but your emphasis is on the worker and is on the wage. So the argument to that would be that you are somehow squeezing out entrepreneurialism. Is that a valid argument?
Well, maintaining full employment is actually one of the mandates of the Federal Reserve. It was put in there in 1978.
Yeah, and there's talk right now about removing that clause because they feel that the Federal, and this is why I brought it up, because there's talk about removing that clause now in that mandate of the Federal Reserve. But Ellen Brown, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Ellen Brown, author of Web of Debt. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.